In this powerful story about systemic racism and corruption, Julian Carter, a successful black whistleblower, exposes a network of bribery and fraud designed to displace marginalized communities and protect the powerful facing relentless attacks, including false charges orchestrated by a racist officer and a community divided between support and prejudice. Julian becomes the target of a coordinated smear campaign. As he fights back against the deeply ingrained biases and abuses of power, Julian's journey highlights the infuriating realities of racism in America and the high stakes of confronting a system designed to silence those who challenge it. The faint hum of the espresso machine buzzed through the air, punctuated by the soft clatter of cups and the low murmur of conversations. The cafe was a small, unassuming place nestled on the corner of a busy city block. It wasn't the kind of spot where anyone would expect to find one of the most influential figures in the country sipping a latte, but that was exactly why Julian Carter liked it. Julian sat at a table near the window, his sharp, tailored suit a quiet anomaly against the cozy, mismatched decor of the cafe. He ran a hand over his close-cropped hair, glancing at his phone as the notifications stacked up. Emails from his board of directors, updates on the foundation he'd established, and yet another message from the mayor's office asking for a meeting. He sighed and silenced the screen, tucking it into his pocket. Here, in this little slice of normalcy, he could breathe. Julian wasn't just a CEO, he was a symbol. The kind of man whose face appeared on the covers of business magazines, with headlines touting his meteoric rise from humble beginnings. A self-made billionaire with a mind for innovation and a heart for justice, he was both celebrated and scrutinized. For some, he represented the promise of a changing world. For others, a challenge to their tightly held beliefs. Despite the weight of his reputation, Julian preferred to move through life without pretense. He drove himself to work in a modest hybrid sedan, wore off-the-rack suits when he could get away with it, and made a point of supporting local businesses like this cafe. Wealth and power, he believed, weren't reasons to distance yourself from the people who made you who you were. The barista, a wiry young man with a mop of red hair and a tattoo snaking up his arm, approached with a smile. "Latte, 2 sugars, right?" Julian returned the smile, his voice smooth and warm. "You've got a good memory." "Not many people order it like that," the barista said, setting the cup on the table. He lingered for a moment, hesitating. "Hey, you look familiar. You ever been on TV or something?" Julian chuckled. "Once or twice. I try to keep a low profile, though." "Well, you might want to try a hat or something. People around here watch a lot of news." With a good-natured laugh, Julian thanked him and returned to his coffee. He could already feel the weight of a few curious glances from nearby tables, the quiet realization spreading through the room like ripples in a pond. He didn't mind, at least here. No one treated him like an icon, or worse, like a threat. Outside, the city buzzed with life. Pedestrians weaved through the streets, taxis honked, and the crisp autumn air carried the faint smell of roasted chestnuts from a cart on the corner. Julian watched it all from his seat, taking a rare moment to reflect. The city was his playground and his battlefield, a place where dreams were made and barriers were broken, but it was also a place where prejudices lingered, clinging stubbornly to the cracks in its foundation. His phone buzzed again, this time with a reminder about the day's next engagement. The courthouse. Julian glanced at his watch. He had just enough time to finish his coffee before heading out. Today's agenda was a little different from his usual. He wasn't meeting with investors or giving a keynote speech. Instead, he'd been called to mediate a local dispute, a community housing issue that had spiraled into a legal battle. It wasn't his typical arena, but it was a cause close to his heart, and he'd promised to help however he could. The courthouse was a grand old building, its marble columns and wide steps standing as a monument to justice, or at least the promise of it. Inside, the air was cooler, heavy with the scent of polished wood and the faint musk of old paper. Julian moved through the space with quiet confidence, nodding politely to those who crossed his path. "Excuse me," a voice called behind him. He turned to see a young clerk, her expression uncertain. "Are you looking for the public seating area?" Julian smiled, his tone even. "Actually, I'm here to meet with Judge Morrison. I believe she's expecting me." The clerk blinked, her cheeks reddening slightly, as she took in the full measure of the man in front of her. "Oh, Mr. Carter. I'm sorry, I didn't realize the judge is in her chambers. I'll take you there." As Julian followed her through the maze of hallways, he noticed the subtle shifts in how people reacted to him. Some offered him deferential nods, recognizing him immediately. Others looked away, their expressions unreadable. He wasn't new to these reactions, but he still noted them, with a practiced detachment. They reached the judge's chambers, and the clerk knocked lightly before opening the door. Inside, Judge Morrison, an older woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, greeted him with a firm handshake. "Julian, good to see you," she said, motioning for him to take a seat. "Thanks for coming on such short notice." "Happy to help," Julian replied, settling into a leather chair across from her desk. "What's the situation?" Judge Morrison leaned back, folding her hands. "It's complicated. The dispute started over zoning laws, but it's ballooned into something much bigger. You've got developers on one side, community advocates on the other, and a lot of folks caught in the middle. I thought your perspective might help us find some common ground." Julian nodded, his expression thoughtful. He'd dealt with situations like this before, where bureaucracy and greed collided with the needs of everyday people. It was the kind of fight he'd built his career on, and he knew the stakes were high. As the judge outlined the details, Julian couldn't help but notice the way her assistant, a younger man standing near the door, kept glancing at him. There was a flicker of something in his eyes. Doubt, perhaps, or skepticism. Julian met his gaze briefly, offering a polite nod, but the assistant quickly looked away. It wasn't unusual for Julian to encounter resistance, even in spaces where his reputation preceded him. Some people saw his presence as an intrusion, a challenge to the status quo. Others simply struggled to reconcile his success with their preconceived notions of what a man like him should be. The meeting wrapped up after an hour, and Judge Morrison walked Julian to the door. "Thanks again for stepping in," she said. "I'll let you know when we're ready to move forward." "Looking forward to it," Julian replied, shaking her hand. As he made his way back through the courthouse, the subtle tensions that had simmered throughout the day came into sharper focus. A hushed conversation stopped abruptly as he passed by. A security guard watched him a little too closely. These were small things, but they added up. Quiet reminders that even here, in a place dedicated to fairness and equality, bias still lingered in the corners. Julian stepped out into the late afternoon sun, taking a deep breath of the crisp air. The day wasn't over yet, and he knew the road ahead would be long, but he also knew that change never came easily. It was a fight he'd chosen long ago, and one he wasn't willing to abandon. With that thought, he pulled out his phone and dialed a familiar number. The voice on the other end picked up immediately, warm and reassuring. "How did it go?" asked Mia, his sister and closest confidant. "About as expected," Julian replied, his tone steady. "There's a lot of work to do, but we'll get there." "You always do," Mia said, her voice filled with quiet confidence. "Don't let them wear you down." Julian smiled, her words a balm to his spirit. "Never." As he walked toward his car, the city buzzed around him, its energy a constant reminder of the challenges and opportunities that lay ahead. Julian Carter was a man of many roles, leader, advocate, brother, but above all, he was a man determined to leave the world better than he'd found it. And today was just the beginning. Julian Carter adjusted the lapel of his jacket as he crossed the bustling plaza outside the courthouse. The air carried the faint aroma of street food and exhaust, blending with the distant sounds of traffic and city chatter. A brisk wind tugged at his coat as he approached the sleek black sedan waiting at the curb, where a valet handed over the keys with a deferential smile. "Busy day, Mr. Carter?" the valet asked. "Always," Julian replied, with a polite nod, slipping into the driver's seat. The drive to his next stop, a community outreach event in a struggling neighborhood on the south side of the city, took him through winding streets that told a story of inequality. Gleaming skyscrapers gave way to graffiti-streaked apartment blocks, their windows boarded up and their sidewalks littered with debris. It wasn't his first time visiting this area. He'd spent years building relationships here, providing resources and advocating for change. Yet, the contrast between this neighborhood and the courthouse's marble grandeur never failed to hit him like a punch to the gut. When Julian pulled into the parking lot of the community center, the tension was already palpable. A small group of men loitered near the entrance, their conversation punctuated by low laughter and darting glances toward him. As Julian stepped out of the car, One of them leaned against the hood, feigning indifference, but making a point to block his path. "Nice ride," the man drawled, his tone dripping with mockery. "You lost or something?" Julian met the man's gaze, his expression calm but firm. "No, I'm exactly where I need to be." "Excuse me." The man didn't move, his smirk widening. "Big man in a suit? You think you're better than us or something?" Julian's pulse quickened, but he maintained his composure. "I'm here for the outreach meeting. If you'll excuse me, I'd like to head inside." A tense silence hung between them before the man finally stepped aside with a muttered, "Whatever, man." Julian could feel their eyes on his back as he walked toward the door, the weight of their unspoken judgments pressing down on him. Inside, the atmosphere was slightly warmer. Volunteers bustled about, setting up tables and distributing flyers. The center's director, a middle-aged woman named Rosa, greeted Julian with a broad smile. "Julian. It's so good to see you," Rosa said, enveloping him in a brief hug. Her warmth was a welcome reprieve from the hostility outside. "Good to see you too, Rosa," Julian replied. "How's the turnout looking?" "Better than expected," Rosa said, leading him toward the main hall. "But we've had some, let's say, spirited discussions already. Tensions are high." Julian nodded, already anticipating the challenges ahead. He'd come to speak about a new housing initiative aimed at addressing the neighborhood's displacement crisis, a proposal that had sparked both hope and skepticism among the residents. While some saw him as a champion of progress, others viewed him as an outsider, with no real understanding of their struggles. As he stepped into the hall, the murmurs began. A few heads turned, whispers trailing in his wake. He could feel the weight of their scrutiny, the subtle shift in the air, as some judged him not for his efforts, but for what he represented. Wealth, power, privilege. Julian kept his head high, his expression measured. The meeting began smoothly enough, with Rosa introducing him and outlining the goals of the initiative. Julian took the floor, his voice steady and persuasive as he spoke about affordable housing, equitable development, and community empowerment. The room was quiet, but he could see the skepticism etched on some faces. When he opened the floor for questions, the tone shifted. "How do we know this isn't just another scheme to push us out?" A man in the back called out, his arms crossed. "Developers always say they're helping, but all they do is make things worse." Julian met the man's gaze, his tone respectful, but firm. "I understand your concerns. That's why this initiative is different. It's driven by input from the community. Your input. We're not looking to displace anyone. We want to create opportunities for families to stay here and thrive." Another voice chimed in, sharper this time. "That's easy for you to say from your high-rise office. Do you even know what it's like to live here, to struggle every day, just to keep a roof over your head?" The accusation stung, but Julian didn't flinch. "You're right," he said after a moment, his voice quieter, but no less steady. "I don't know what it's like to live here, but I do know what it's like to fight against a system that's designed to keep people down. That's why I'm here. To fight alongside you, not over you." The room fell silent, the tension thick. Julian could feel the weight of their anger and distrust, but he also saw glimmers of something else. Curiosity, perhaps even hope. It was a fragile thread, but one worth holding on to. The meeting ended on a cautious note, with several residents staying behind to speak with Julian individually. As he packed up his materials, a young boy approached him, his wide eyes filled with curiosity. "Are you really that guy from TV?" the boy asked. Julian chuckled, crouching to the boy's level. "Depends on what you saw on TV." "My mom said you're a billionaire," the boy said, his voice a mix of awe and disbelief. "But you don't look like one." Julian smiled, ruffling the boy's hair. "What's a billionaire supposed to look like?" The boy shrugged, his cheeks turning pink. "I don't know, like, fancier." Julian laughed, standing as the boy's mother approached, her expression sheepish. "Sorry about that," she said. "He's got a million questions." "No need to apologize," Julian replied warmly. "Curiosity is a good thing." The woman hesitated, then extended her hand. "Thank you for coming today. I wasn't sure what to think about all this, but it means something that you're here." Julian shook her hand, his voice sincere. "It means something to me too." As he left the center, The hostility from earlier greeted him like a wall. The same group of men lingered near his car, their laughter louder now, their movements more deliberate. Julian felt a pang of unease as he approached, his footsteps measured. "Meeting go well?" one of them asked, stepping closer. His tone was casual, but there was an edge to it. "It was productive," Julian replied, keeping his voice calm. "Excuse me." The man didn't move, his smirk turning into a sneer. "You think you're saving the world or something?" "I'm just trying to help," Julian said, his patience wearing thin. "Now, if you'll excuse me." The man stepped aside, his movements exaggerated. "Sure, Mr. Big Shot, go save the world." Julian slid into his car, his grip on the steering wheel tightening as he pulled out of the lot. He drove in silence, his mind a storm of thoughts. The anger simmered just beneath the surface, but he forced himself to breathe, to focus. He couldn't afford to lose control. Not here, not now. By the time he reached his apartment, the city lights had blurred into streaks of gold and white against the dark sky. Julian sat in his car for a long moment, his hands resting on the wheel, his chest heavy with frustration and weariness. This was the fight he'd chosen, but tonight, it felt more like the fight had chosen him. The night settled over the city, draping the streets in a muted glow of streetlights and neon signs. Julian Carter sat in his apartment, staring at the open laptop on his desk. The report in front of him was damning, a detailed account of the systemic corruption that had been quietly shaping the housing crisis for decades. Developers greased the palms of city officials, zoning laws were manipulated to displace low-income residents, and public funds meant for housing initiatives were siphoned into private accounts. Julian leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. The evidence was airtight, but exposing it would unleash a storm. If he moved forward, there would be retaliation, against him, against the community he was trying to protect, and against anyone who dared to stand with him. His phone buzzed, dragging him from his thoughts. It was a message from Rosa. "Need to talk. Come to the community center ASAP." A knot of unease formed in Julian's stomach, but he grabbed his coat and headed out, the cool night air slicing through his thoughts as he drove. When he arrived at the center, the parking lot was eerily empty, except for Rosa's car, parked haphazardly near the entrance. The flickering overhead light cast long, shifting shadows across the lot. Inside, Rosa stood near the entrance, her face pale and tense. Beside her was Mitchell, the younger assistant from Judge Morrison's office, his expression tight with worry. "Rosa, what's going on?" Julian asked, his voice low and urgent. Rosa exchanged a glance with Mitchell before speaking. "You've been targeted, Julian. The report you're working on, it's already leaked to the wrong people." Mitchell stepped forward, his voice tinged with guilt. "The judge's chambers have been bugged. I didn't realize it until today. The developers know everything. They've got connections in the city, police, media, even the mayor's office. They're planning to discredit you." Julian's stomach sank, but his expression remained calm. "What kind of retaliation are we talking about?" Rosa hesitated, then handed him a folder. Inside were photographs, grainy surveillance shots of Julian at the community center, at the courthouse, even entering his own apartment building. Alongside the photos were printed social media posts, doctored to imply mismanagement of funds at his foundation and fabricated connections to unsavory figures. "They're building a case to smear you," Rosa said, her voice shaking. "And that's not all. There's been talk about using the police to escalate things, an arrest, a raid, something public to humiliate you." Julian felt the heat of anger rising in his chest, but he pushed it down, his mind racing. "We can't let them win. If they're this desperate, it means we're getting too close to the truth." Mitchell shook his head. "Julian, these people play dirty. They don't care about the truth, they care about keeping their power." "That's exactly why we have to fight," Julian said, his voice firm. "If we back down now, they'll keep doing this to anyone who tries to stand up to them." The sound of sirens cut through the tense silence, drawing their attention to the window. Julian's heart sank as red and blue lights filled the parking lot. Several police cars pulled in, officers spilling out with a grim sense of purpose. At the front was Officer Daniels, a stocky man with a face carved from granite and a reputation for bending the law to suit his whims. Julian clenched his jaw, stepping toward the door just as it burst open. Daniels entered with a swagger, his eyes locking onto Julian like a predator sighting prey. "Julian Carter," Daniels announced, his voice dripping with mock authority. "You're under arrest for fraud and embezzlement." Rosa gasped, but Julian held up a hand, silencing her. "On what grounds?" he asked, his voice calm but steely. Daniels smirked, holding up a warrant. "Anonymous tip seems your little foundation's been funneling money into some questionable accounts." Julian knew it was a setup, but he also knew protesting would only escalate the situation. "I'll come quietly," he said, holding out his hands. The cold steel of the handcuffs bit into his wrists, but he kept his expression neutral, refusing to give Daniels the satisfaction of a reaction. As the officers led Julian out, the small crowd that had gathered in the parking lot erupted in whispers and gasps. Rosa and Mitchell followed, their faces pale with worry. "This isn't over, Julian," Rosa called out. "We'll get you out of this." Julian turned his head slightly, offering her a faint smile of reassurance. "I know." The ride to the station was suffocating. Daniels sat in the passenger seat, throwing occasional glances at Julian in the back seat. "You think you're some kind of hero," Daniels said, his tone mocking. "You come into this city, flashing your money around, thinking you can fix things, but you're just another fraud." Julian met his gaze through the rearview mirror, his voice calm but pointed. "And you're just another pawn. How does it feel knowing you're helping the people who are destroying this community?" Daniel's smirk faltered for a moment before he turned away, muttering something under his breath. At the station, the booking process was designed to humiliate Julian, endured the fingerprinting, the mugshots, and the accusatory stares of the officers with quiet dignity. Every step felt like a calculated attempt to break him, but he refused to give them the satisfaction. After what felt like hours, he was placed in a holding cell, the cold metal bench pressing against his back as he sat in silence. His mind raced, replaying the events of the night and strategizing his next move. He knew his allies, Rosa, Mitchell, even the judge, would be working tirelessly to clear his name, but the fight was far from over. Outside the station, the story was already spinning out of control. News crews had gathered, their cameras trained on the entrance as reporters speculated about Julian's arrest. Social media buzzed with hashtags and hot takes, many of them parroting the fabricated narrative planted by the developers. But amid the noise, a quieter resistance began to take shape. Community leaders, activists, and residents who had seen Julian's work firsthand started to speak out, their voices cutting through the cacophony with messages of support and defiance. Rosa stood at the forefront of this effort, organizing a rally outside the station. By dawn, dozens of people had gathered, their chants echoing through the streets. "Justice for Julian! Stop the corruption!" Inside his cell, Julian could hear the faint echoes of their voices, a small but powerful reminder that he wasn't alone. He closed his eyes, drawing strength from their resolve. This wasn't just his fight, it was theirs too. The door to the holding area opened, and Julian looked up to see Mitchell entering, flanked by a public defender. The lawyer's expression was serious, but determined. "Mr. Carter," the lawyer began, "we're working to secure your release, but it's going to take time. The charges are baseless, but the judge overseeing this case is compromised." Julian nodded, his jaw tightening. "Then we find another way." Mitchell leaned closer, lowering his voice. "The files you showed me, the ones proving the corruption, we can use them. If we leak them to the press now, it could shift the narrative." Julian hesitated. Leaking the files would expose the corruption, but it would also put his allies at risk. The developers wouldn't go down without a fight, and the backlash could be devastating. After a moment, he nodded. "Do it. But be careful. No one else gets dragged into this." Mitchell nodded, his expression resolute. "We've got your back, Julian." As Mitchell left, Julian sat back on the bench, his mind racing. The storm was here, and the next move would decide everything. The faint echoes of the rally outside grew louder, their chants filling the air like a drumbeat of defiance. Julian stood, his resolve hardening. He had chosen this fight, and he would see it through, no matter the cost. The metal door to the holding cell creaked open, flooding the cramped space with harsh fluorescent light. Officer Daniels stood in the doorway, his smug expression amplified by the clinking of keys at his hip. "Time to go, Carter," Daniels announced, stepping aside to allow 2 other officers to flank Julian. Julian rose slowly, his composure unshaken despite the tightening knot in his stomach. "Where are we going?" he asked calmly. Daniels's smirk widened. "To see your adoring public." They led Julian through the winding corridors of the police station, the distant hum of voices growing louder with each step. When they reached the main entrance, Julian saw the throng of reporters outside, their cameras flashing like strobe lights through the glass doors. Behind them stood dozens of community members, holding signs with slogans like, "Justice for Julian," and "End the corruption." Their chants grew louder the moment they spotted him. As Julian was escorted onto the steps, the chaos erupted. Reporters shouted questions, thrusting microphones toward him. Protesters cheered, while others demanded answers from the police. Julian's presence had become a flashpoint, the tension in the air crackling like a live wire. Daniels leaned closer, his voice low and mocking. "Smile for the cameras, Carter. This is the image everyone's going to remember, the savior in handcuffs." Julian ignored him, focusing instead on the crowd. He caught sight of Rosa near the front, her face a mixture of anger and determination, as she shouted alongside the protesters. Mitchell stood beside her, gripping a folder tightly against his chest. The sight of his allies gave Julian a surge of resolve. "Julian," a reporter called, her voice rising above the noise. "Do you have anything to say about the charges against you?" Julian stopped, turning to face the cameras. His hands were cuffed, but his posture remained straight, his expression resolute. "These charges are baseless," he said, his voice steady and commanding. "This is an attempt to silence me because I dared to expose the truth, but let me be clear, I will not back down. The people behind this corruption want you to believe their lies, but the evidence speaks for itself. Justice will prevail." The crowd roared in response, a mix of cheers and jeers. Daniels grabbed Julian's arm roughly, dragging him toward the waiting police car. "That's enough grandstanding," he muttered, shoving Julian into the back seat. Back at the station, the tension was palpable. Julian was returned to his cell, but this time, the weight of the moment pressed heavier on his chest. He paced the small space, his mind racing. He couldn't afford to wait for the system to clear his name. He had to act now. Moments later, the door opened again, and Mitchell entered, his face flushed from the chaos outside. He clutched the folder tightly, his knuckles white. "They're spinning this fast," Mitchell said, his voice urgent. "The developers are pushing their narrative hard, but we've started leaking the documents, the media's picking it up, and people are asking questions." "That's good," Julian said, though his tone carried a weight of caution. "But it's not enough. They'll bury this if we don't give them something they can't ignore." Mitchell hesitated, then opened the folder, revealing a stack of papers. "There's more. I pulled these from the judge's files before coming here. It's a direct connection between the developers and city officials. Emails, signed agreements, payment logs. It's airtight, Julian." Julian's breath caught as he scanned the documents. The evidence was explosive, enough to topple the entire corrupt system if released, but it also came with a risk. "If we leak this, they'll come after everyone involved," Julian said, his voice low. "Including you." Mitchell shook his head. "This is bigger than me. It's bigger than all of us. If we don't do this now, they'll keep getting away with it." Julian met his gaze, his heart swelling with gratitude for the younger man's courage. "Then we do it," he said. "But we do it smart. We need to get this to someone who can amplify it, someone they can't silence." Mitchell nodded. "I'll reach out to national outlets. This story won't just stay local." Hours passed, the quiet hum of the station broken only by the occasional shuffle of footsteps outside Julian's cell. He sat on the bench, his mind turning over the details of their plan. Every move had to be precise. One misstep could dismantle everything. The sound of approaching footsteps pulled him from his thoughts. This time, it was Rosa, escorted by a young officer who looked nervous just being near her. "They said I had 10 minutes, Rosa announced, as the officer unlocked the cell door. Julian rose, meeting her gaze. "You shouldn't be here." "Neither should you," Rosa shot back, stepping inside. Her voice softened as she continued. "Mitchell filled me in. If this works, Julian, it could change everything. But are you ready for what comes next? They're going to hit back harder than ever." "I'm ready," Julian said without hesitation. "The truth is worth it." Rosa reached out, gripping his arm. Then know this. We're with you. No matter what happens, you're not alone. The night dragged on, the hours bleeding together as Julian awaited the fallout from Mitchell's leaks. By morning, the impact was unmistakable. The first sign came in the form of a commotion outside the station. Through the small window of his cell, Julian could see a new wave of reporters gathering, their cameras trained on the entrance. He couldn't hear their questions, but the urgency in their movements was clear. The second sign was Daniels storming into the holding area, his face a storm cloud of barely contained rage. Looks like your little stunt worked, Daniels spat, tossing a newspaper onto the bench beside Julian. The front page headline read, Corruption Exposed. Leaked documents reveal web of bribes and fraud in City Hall. Below the headline was a photo of Julian, the image of him speaking to the cameras just hours earlier. The accompanying article detailed the leaked evidence, implicating key players in the city's government and private sector. They're calling for an independent investigation, Daniels continued, his voice seething. You think this makes you a hero? All you've done is piss off a lot of powerful people. Julian stood, his calm demeanor unshaken. The truth isn't about being a hero, Daniels. It's about accountability. Something you wouldn't understand. Daniels' jaw tightened, but he said nothing, turning on his heel and storming out. By midday, Julian was released on bail, thanks to the mounting public pressure. As he stepped out of the station, the roar of the crowd hit him like a wave. Supporters held signs, their cheers blending with the shouted questions of reporters. Julian raised a hand in acknowledgement, his face calm but resolute. Rosa and Mitchell were waiting for him at the edge of the crowd, their expressions a mix of relief and determination. This is just the beginning, Mitchell said as Julian approached. Julian nodded. Then let's make it count. As they walked toward Rosa's car, a dark SUV pulled up to the curb. The tinted window rolled down, revealing a man in a sharp suit with an unsettling smile. Mr. Carter, the man said smoothly, we need to talk. Julian froze, his instincts kicking in. The tension in the air was palpable, the man's presence radiating quiet menace. Who are you? Julian asked, his voice steady despite the unease curling in his chest. The man's smile widened. Let's just say, I represent interests that don't appreciate your interference. Shall we take a ride? Julian Carter's pulse thrummed in his ears as he climbed into the dark SUV, his every instinct screaming at him to walk away. But he couldn't. Not now. If these were the people pulling the strings, he had to face them head-on. The man in the sharp suit sat across from him, his smile sharp and predatory, as the car pulled away from the curb. Relax, Mr. Carter, the man said smoothly, gesturing to the plush leather seats. This isn't an ambush, just a conversation. Julian leaned back, his posture calm despite the tension coiling in his chest. A conversation about what? The man's smile widened. About how you've made yourself quite a problem for some very powerful people who don't appreciate their business being dragged into the spotlight. Julian met the man's gaze evenly. If by business you mean bribery, fraud, and the systematic displacement of entire communities, then yes, I can see why they're upset. The man chuckled, the sound cold and humorless. You've got spirit, I'll give you that. But let's cut to the chase. You've stirred up a lot of trouble with those leaks. If you were smart, you'd step back now before things get messy. Julian felt a surge of anger rise in his chest, but he kept his voice steady. Is that a threat? It's an opportunity, the man replied, leaning forward. You've made your point. You've shown the world how righteous and principled you are. But you've also put yourself in the crosshairs of people who don't lose, so here's the deal. We'll make this all go away. The charges, the media frenzy, everything. You just have to drop this crusade and walk away. Julian held the man's gaze, his mind racing. This was the moment they'd been working toward. A direct admission of guilt, an acknowledgement of the corruption he'd spent years fighting to expose. But the offer was a trap, designed to silence him while protecting the system that had wrought so much damage. You think you can buy me off? Julian said, his voice low but steady. Do you really think I'm going to abandon the people who are counting on me? The man's smile faded, replaced by a thin veneer of irritation. Don't be naive, Carter. You're not a hero, you're just a man. A man who's dangerously close to losing everything. Julian leaned forward, his eyes blazing with determination. You're right, I'm just a man. But you know what? That's enough, because the truth doesn't need a hero. It just needs someone willing to fight for it. The man's expression darkened, his polished demeanor slipping for a moment. You're making a mistake. Julian smiled, a quiet confidence radiating from him. No, you are. As the SUV rolled to a stop outside a nondescript office building, Julian's phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at the screen. A text from Mitchell. Documents released. Media running the story. It's everywhere. The man in the suit seemed to sense the shift in Julian's energy. What's that smile for? Julian slid his phone back into his pocket, his expression cool. You'll find out soon enough. Before the man could respond, the door opened, and Julian stepped out onto the sidewalk. He didn't wait for an invitation to leave. He simply walked away, his shoulders squared, and his stride purposeful. The SUV idled for a moment before pulling away, its dark silhouette vanishing into the city's chaotic swirl. The fallout began almost immediately. By the time Julian returned to the community center, the leaked documents had gone viral. News outlets across the country were running the story, their headlines blaring with words like corruption, cover-up, and community betrayal. The evidence Mitchell had shared was damning, implicating key city officials, developers, and even law enforcement in a sprawling network of corruption. Inside the center, the atmosphere was electric. Rosa was coordinating calls with media outlets, while Mitchell worked furiously at a laptop. Updating their social media accounts with links to the coverage, volunteers buzzed around the room, their excitement tempered by the gravity of what was unfolding. Julian stepped inside, and the room fell silent for a moment before erupting into cheers. You did it, Rosa said, rushing over to embrace him. The truth is out. It's not over yet, Julian said, though he couldn't help but smile at their enthusiasm. Now we see how they respond. The response came quickly, and viciously. The next morning, Julian awoke to find his name splashed across every major news outlet. While some lauded him as a whistleblower and a champion of justice, others painted him as a dangerous agitator who had destabilized the city's leadership. The developers and their allies fought back with a coordinated smear campaign, accusing Julian of fabricating evidence and orchestrating the leaks for personal gain. But the tide of public opinion was shifting. The protests outside City Hall grew larger by the hour, fueled by the undeniable evidence of corruption. Community leaders, activists, and even some local politicians began to speak out, demanding accountability and systemic reform. The pressure reached a boiling point that evening when Julian agreed to a live interview with a national news anchor. The studio was a sterile, high-tech space, the bright lights and cameras amplifying the weight of the moment. Julian sat across from the anchor, his demeanor calm but resolute, as the questions came rapid-fire. Mr. Carter, your revelations have sent shockwaves through this city and beyond, the anchor began. But your critics claim you've overstepped, that your actions have jeopardized the city's stability. How do you respond? Julian took a breath, his voice steady. The only thing jeopardizing this city's stability is the corruption that's been allowed to fester for decades. The evidence speaks for itself. What we've exposed isn't just about bad actors, it's about a system that prioritizes profit over people. If we don't confront it now, the damage will only get worse. The anchor leaned forward, her gaze piercing. And what about the threats against you? Are you concerned for your safety? Julian hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering. Of course I'm concerned, but this fight isn't about me, it's about the people who've been silenced and ignored for too long. As long as they're willing to stand with me, I'm not backing down. The interview ended with a standing ovation from the studio audience, and Julian left the building to find a crowd of supporters waiting outside. Their cheers and chants echoed through the night, a testament to the growing movement his actions had sparked. But the battle was far from over. As Julian made his way home, his phone buzzed with a message from Rosa. They're planning something big. Be ready. Julian's heart sank. He didn't know what something big meant, but he knew the people he was fighting wouldn't go down without a fight. He stepped into his apartment, locking the door behind him and bracing himself for whatever came next. As he stood in the quiet of his living room, the weight of the day settled over him. The confrontation with the man in the SUV, the media frenzy, the protests. It all felt like the prelude to something larger, something inevitable. He wasn't sure what the next move would be, but one thing was certain: he was ready. The silence of Julian's apartment was shattered by the sharp, insistent buzz of his intercom. He froze, his heart pounding as he moved toward the panel. "Who is it?" he asked, his voice steady, despite the fear creeping into his chest. A pause. Then a voice crackled through the speaker. "You've gone too far, Carter, time to pay the price." The intercom's crackle faded into a tense silence as Julian stared at the panel, his breath shallow. He recognized the voice. It was Officer Daniels. Julian's instincts screamed at him to stay inside, to call Rosa or Mitchell. But he knew that would only escalate the situation. Daniels wasn't the type to retreat. And whatever was about to happen, Julian needed to face it head on. Taking a deep breath, Julian unlocked the door and stepped into the hallway. His footsteps echoed against the bare walls as he made his way to the building's lobby. The tension in the air was suffocating, every shadow and creak amplifying his unease. Daniels was waiting just outside the glass doors, flanked by two other officers. Their postures were rigid, their expressions unreadable. Behind them, the street was eerily quiet, the usual hum of the city replaced by an unsettling stillness. Julian pushed open the door, his eyes locking onto Daniels. "What do you want?" Daniels smirked, stepping forward. "Just a friendly chat, Carter. You've been busy stirring the pot, and it's time we clear the air." Julian crossed his arms, his voice calm but firm. "If you've got something to say, say it. Otherwise, I suggest you leave." Daniel's smirk faded, replaced by a thin veneer of anger. "You think you're untouchable, don't you? You think your fancy leaks and your media circus can protect you. But let me tell you something. You've got no idea how deep this goes." Julian took a step closer, his gaze unwavering. "Then enlighten me. Who's pulling your strings, Daniels? Is it the developers, the politicians? Or are you just another pawn in their game?" The other officers shifted uncomfortably, exchanging uneasy glances. Daniel's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Julian thought he might lash out. Instead, he laughed. A cold, bitter sound that sent a chill down Julian's spine. "You don't get it, do you?" Daniel said, his voice low. "This isn't about them. This is about people like you, people who think they can waltz into our world and tear it apart. You don't belong here, Carter. You never did." The weight of Daniel's words hung in the air, their meaning clear. This wasn't just about corruption or power. It was about prejudice, an entrenched belief that Julian, with his success and determination, was a threat to the status quo. Julian felt a surge of anger rise in his chest, but he forced it down, his voice steady as he replied, "You're right, I don't belong here, because I believe in a system that works for everyone, not just the people at the top, and if that makes me a threat to you, then so be it." Daniels took a step closer, his face inches from Julian's. "You're walking a fine line, Carter. Push any further, and you won't like where it leads." Julian met his gaze, unflinching. "The truth's already out, Daniels. You can't stop it." Daniels' expression twisted into a snarl, and he turned to the officers behind him. "Take him." The officers hesitated, their discomfort evident. One of them, a younger man with sharp features and a nervous energy, spoke up. "Sir, are we sure about this if we—" "I gave you an order," Daniels snapped, cutting him off. "Do it." The younger officer's hesitation was all Julian needed. He raised his voice, his tone commanding. "Think about what you're doing. If you follow him now, you're complicit. But if you stand up, you can be part of the change this city needs." The officer glanced between Julian and Daniels, the conflict written across his face. Finally, he stepped back, lowering his hand from his holster. "I'm not doing this." Daniels' face turned red with fury. "You're making a mistake, rookie." "No," the younger officer replied, his voice firm. "You are." Daniels turned to the second officer, but she too hesitated, her hand hovering uncertainly by her side. Realizing he was losing control, Daniels snarled and stepped toward Julian, his hand darting toward his baton. Julian braced himself, his heart pounding, but before Daniels could strike, the sound of sirens filled the air. 3 patrol cars pulled up, their lights flashing as more officers spilled out onto the scene. At their head was Sheriff Walter Davies, his expression stern as he approached. Daniels, Walter barked, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Stand down. Daniels froze, his face a mixture of anger and disbelief. Sheriff, this man… Enough, Walter interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. He turned to the other officers. Secure Daniels, and take him back to the station. I'll deal with him personally. The younger officer stepped forward, his movements cautious but deliberate. Daniels shot Julian a venomous glare as he was led away, his protests fading into the night. Walter approached Julian, his gaze heavy with concern. Are you all right? Julian nodded, though his hands trembled slightly. I'm fine, thank you for stepping in. Walter sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. You've stirred up a hornet's nest, Carter, but I've seen the evidence you're doing the right thing. Just be careful. There are still people out there who won't stop until they silence you. Julian met Walter's gaze, a flicker of gratitude passing between them. I appreciate that, but I'm not backing down. Walter nodded, his respect evident. Then let's make sure you stay safe. Come on, I'll take you somewhere secure. As Julian climbed into Walter's car, the weight of the night settled over him. The confrontation with Daniels had exposed not just the corruption, but the deeper prejudice that fueled it. And while the immediate danger had passed, he knew the fight was far from over. The car pulled away, the city's lights blurring into streaks of gold and white. Julian stared out the window, his mind racing with the possibilities of what came next. He had won a battle, but the war was just beginning. As they drove through the quiet streets, Walter's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his brow furrowing. What is it? Julian asked, sensing the shift in the sheriff's demeanor. Walter hesitated, his grip tightening on the wheel. There's been a breach at the precinct. The files you leaked, they've triggered something bigger than we anticipated. Julian's chest tightened. What kind of breach? Walter's expression darkened. The kind that puts a target on your back and everyone else who's standing with you. The car sped into the night, the weight of Walter's words hanging heavily in the air. The hum of fluorescent lights buzzed softly in the precinct as Julian Carter stepped into a small, hastily assembled conference room. Around the table sat his allies, Rosa, Mitchell, Sheriff Walter Davies, and 2 representatives from the state attorney general's office. The air was thick with anticipation, every pair of eyes trained on a stack of folders in the middle of the table. These, Mitchell began, tapping the stack, are the final pieces of evidence enough to ensure this case doesn't disappear into bureaucracy. Julian nodded, his jaw tightening. And Daniels? Walter leaned forward, his expression grim. He's been suspended pending an internal investigation, but that's not enough. He's a symptom, not the disease. One of the state attorneys, a sharp-eyed woman in a navy suit, spoke up. The leaks have forced the governor's office to act. A special task force is being assembled to address corruption in city departments, starting with the police and zoning boards. This is just the beginning. Rosa let out a soft sigh of relief. So the wheels are finally turning. They are, the attorney replied, but there's a long road ahead. The developers behind all this won't go quietly. They've already started lobbying to discredit the task force. They'll fight tooth and nail to hold on to their power. Julian took a deep breath, his mind swirling with the weight of what lay ahead. Then we keep fighting. We've come too far to back down now. The next morning, news broke that Officer Daniels had been formally charged with multiple counts of misconduct, and conspiracy footage of his arrest outside the precinct quickly circulated online, showing the once smug officer being led away in handcuffs, his face pale and tight with anger. For Julian, the moment was bittersweet. Daniels had been a key player in the corruption, but he wasn't the mastermind. Still, the public nature of his downfall sent a powerful message. Accountability was possible, even for those who thought themselves untouchable. Later that day, Julian stood on the steps of City Hall, addressing a crowd of reporters and supporters. The air was crisp, the energy electric as he spoke. This is not just about one officer or one group of developers, Julian said, his voice steady and resonant. This is about a system that has failed its people for far too long today. We've taken a step toward justice, but our work is far from over together. We can rebuild this city, fairly, equitably, and with the voices of its people at the center. The crowd erupted into cheers, their chants of justice for all echoing across the plaza. For the first time in weeks, Julian felt a flicker of hope. Not just for himself, but for the community that had rallied around him. That evening, Julian returned to his apartment, the weight of the day finally catching up to him. The quiet was almost disorienting after the chaos of the past few weeks. He sank into his couch, staring at the city lights through the window. He had changed. The Julian Carter who had stepped into this fight was confident but cautious, driven but unsure of his ability to challenge such entrenched power. Now, he was resolute. The ordeal had sharpened him, deepened his understanding of the stakes and the resilience required to confront them. As his phone buzzed with messages of congratulations and support, Julian allowed himself a rare moment of pride. He wasn't just fighting for justice, he was learning to lead in a way that inspired others to join the fight. The ripple effects of Julian's actions were immediate and profound. Over the following weeks, protests turned into organized advocacy, with community leaders drafting proposals for systemic reform. Town hall meetings grew in attendance, filled with passionate voices demanding transparency and accountability. Local media shifted its tone, moving from skepticism to cautious optimism as public pressure mounted. Even some of the city's more entrenched officials began to distance themselves from the corruption, hoping to salvage their reputations. Rosa's community center became a hub of activism. Its once sparse attendance swelling with volunteers eager to contribute. Rosa beamed as she shared updates with Julian, her pride in their progress shining through. "This isn't just a movement anymore," she said one afternoon. "It's a revolution." But the battle wasn't without setbacks. The developers fought back with lawsuits and counterclaims, using their vast resources to stall progress. Anonymous threats trickled in, reminders that the fight for justice often came with personal risk. Julian also struggled with the emotional toll. Late nights and early mornings took their toll on his health, and he often found himself haunted by the memories of Daniel's venomous words, or the moments when it felt like the entire system was stacked against him. Yet, every time he faltered, he reminded himself of the faces in the crowd, the children who would grow up in a better city because of their work. That was enough to keep him moving forward. One afternoon, Julian received a call from Mitchell, who had been working closely with the task force. "There's an opportunity," Mitchell said, his voice tinged with excitement. "The task force wants you to join as an advisor. They're impressed with how you've mobilized the community." Julian paused, the weight of the offer settling over him. It was a chance to bring his fight to a higher level, to institutionalize the changes they had begun, but it also meant stepping into the lion's den, facing even greater opposition from those determined to maintain the status quo. "I'll think about it," Julian replied, but deep down, he knew his answer. Later that week, he stood in Rosa's office, gazing at a map of the city pinned to the wall. "What do you think?" he asked her. "Should I join the task force?" Rosa crossed her arms, her expression thoughtful. "I think you already know what you need to do. The question is, are you ready for what comes next?" Julian smiled, his resolve clear. "I've faced worse." That night, Julian returned to his favorite spot by the river, the water reflecting the city lights in a shimmering mosaic. He sat on the bench, letting the cool breeze wash over him as he reflected on the journey so far. He had faced prejudice, corruption, and betrayal, but he had also discovered the power of solidarity and the resilience of a community united by a common goal. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, he felt ready for whatever came next. As he stared at the horizon, the first light of dawn breaking through the darkness, Julian felt a quiet but unshakable certainty. Change was possible, and he was just getting started. Julian Carter stood at the edge of the riverbank, watching as the first rays of dawn painted the city in soft gold. The water shimmered like liquid glass, mirroring the skyline that stood as both a symbol of possibility and a stark reminder of the challenges that still loomed ahead. For the first time in weeks, Julian allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. The events that had unfolded had pushed him to his limits, physically, emotionally, and morally. Yet, through the turmoil, he had emerged stronger, his resolve sharpened by every setback and every victory. Julian had always believed in justice, but the fight he had waged had redefined what justice meant to him. It wasn't just about exposing corruption or holding individuals accountable. It was about building a system where voices that had long been silenced could finally be heard. The experience had changed him. Julian had stepped into the conflict with a sense of righteous anger, fueled by his belief that the truth alone would be enough to dismantle entrenched power. But he had learned that truth, while powerful, was only the first step. Real change required resilience, collaboration, and a willingness to face opposition at every turn. In the weeks since the confrontation with Officer Daniels and the release of the leaked documents, Julian had found himself at the center of a growing movement. The community that had once been fragmented and disillusioned was now united, energized by the possibility of a fairer, more equitable future. But Julian's growth wasn't just about his role as a leader. On a personal level, he had learned to lean on others, to trust in the strength of collective action. Rosa, Mitchell, Sheriff Davies, and countless others had shown him that progress wasn't a solitary pursuit. It was a shared journey. The struggle Julian had faced was deeply personal, but it also reflected a broader societal reckoning. The systemic corruption he had exposed was rooted in more than greed. It was underpinned by deeply ingrained prejudices and inequities that had persisted for generations. Daniels wasn't just an antagonist. He was a product of a system that thrived on division and exploitation. The events had forced Julian to confront the uncomfortable truth that change wasn't simply about removing bad actors, it was about dismantling the systems that enabled them. The developers, the politicians, the corrupt officers. They were symptoms of a larger problem, one that demanded sustained effort and vigilance to address. Yet, there was hope. The public outcry sparked by the revelations had led to tangible steps toward reform. The governor's task force was a start, but more importantly, the community itself had become a force to be reckoned with. People who had once felt powerless were now organizing, advocating, and demanding accountability. Julian's fight had illuminated a path forward, not just for Willow Creek, but for other cities grappling with similar challenges. His story was a reminder that even in the face of systemic injustice, individual courage and collective action could make a difference. As Julian stood by the river, he thought about the faces he had seen in the crowd. The young boy who had asked if he was really a billionaire, the elderly woman who had tearfully thanked him for fighting for her neighborhood, the volunteers who had poured their energy into the movement, without hesitation. They were the reason he had kept going. Even when the odds seemed insurmountable, their resilience inspired him, and he hoped his journey would inspire others. Change wasn't easy, it was messy, exhausting, and often met with fierce resistance. But it was also necessary, and it was worth every sacrifice. Julian had come to understand that progress wasn't linear. There would be setbacks, missteps, and moments of doubt. But every small victory, every conversation that challenged old prejudices, every step forward, no matter how tentative, mattered. To anyone watching his story, Julian wanted to convey one simple message. Never underestimate the power of standing up. Whether it was speaking out against injustice, supporting a neighbor, or simply refusing to accept the status quo, every action contributed to the greater fight for equality and justice. As the sun climbed higher, Julian felt a sense of closure. Not because the fight was over, but because he was ready for what came next. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind of revelations, confrontations, and hard-won victories. But they had also been a testament to the strength of the human spirit and the power of community. Julian's phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a message from Rosa. Big turnout for the rally today. See you there, Julian smiled, typing a quick reply. Wouldn't miss it. He slipped his phone into his pocket and turned away from the river, his steps purposeful as he headed back into the city. The rally would be another opportunity to amplify the movement, to keep the momentum alive. There was still so much to do. Laws to change, minds to open, systems to rebuild. But Julian felt ready. As he walked, the city seemed to hum with a new energy. It wasn't the oppressive buzz of corruption and indifference that had once defined it. It was the sound of possibility, of people waking up to their power and realizing that they could demand better. For Julian, the journey was far from over, but he carried with him the lessons of the past and the hope of what lay ahead. The fight for justice was never truly finished, but that was what made it worth fighting. Julian Carter's story is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the transformative power of collective action. It reminds us that while systemic change is daunting, it is not impossible. By standing together, refusing to be silenced, and working tirelessly for what is right, we can build a world where justice, equality, and compassion prevail.